Here's what the financial news is not telling you. The biggest retirement crisis in modern history did not happen because of a market crash. It did not happen because of a government policy failure. It did not happen because anyone made a catastrophic decision in a single moment. It happened quietly over about 30 years in the background of ordinary working life, and by the time most people understood what had changed, the change was already complete, irreversible, and sitting directly underneath their retirement plan like a structural crack they had never been shown. The people who feel this most acutely are not the ones you'd expect. They are not low-income workers who never had retirement benefits in the first place. They are teachers, mid-level managers, engineers, healthcare professionals, people who did everything right, saved consistently, planned carefully, trusted the system, and are now discovering that the system they trusted had been quietly rebuilt around a fundamentally different set of promises without anyone calling a meeting about it. And here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. The shift I'm about to describe is not happening. It already happened, decades ago, which means the effects are not coming. They are already compounding inside every retirement plan that was built without accounting for what actually changed. By the end of this video, you'll understand 4 things: how the shift happened, and why almost nobody noticed in real time. The specific mechanism by which it transferred risk, not benefit, risk, from the institution to you personally. What that transfer means for the actual numbers in your retirement projection. And 3 specific things that change the calculus for anyone currently building a plan around the retirement system as it exists today, not as it existed 40 years ago. Not generic advice. Specific to what actually changed. Specific to right now. If this is the kind of financial conversation you've been looking for, the honest version, not the reassuring one, hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. We do this every single week. Before I go any further, I want to give you a single image to carry through this entire video, because this concept has a lot of moving parts, and the image keeps it grounded. Think about a bridge. Not a metaphorical bridge to the future. A physical, literal bridge. You drive across it every day without thinking about it. The ground on your side, the ground on the other side. The bridge carries you across. That's the deal. That has always been the deal. Now imagine you're halfway across the bridge one morning and you look down and notice that where there used to be solid steel underneath the road surface, there is now something different. Not absent. Something different. Something that looks similar from above but behaves very differently under pressure. And you were never told about the change. Not because anyone was hiding it, but because the notice was in a document you were never told to read, buried in language designed for people with advanced degrees in actuarial science, delivered to your HR department at a moment when everyone was too busy to pay attention to it. The bridge still carries most people across most of the time. Until it doesn't. That is the story of what happened to employer-sponsored retirement in the modern workplace. And every time I come back to that bridge, and I will come back to it, it will mean something slightly more specific. Something slightly harder to ignore. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Margaret. She is not a real person, but she is a real type. The type sitting in the comments section of a video like this one, reading the responses from people whose situations mirror hers exactly. Margaret is 58 years old. She has worked at the same regional hospital for 31 years, first as a ward nurse, then as a senior clinical coordinator, then as a department manager. She has been a careful, conscientious employee. She participated in every benefit program the hospital offered. She attended every financial literacy session HR put on. She read the summaries. She signed the forms. She believed she understood what she was building. When Margaret started at the hospital in the early 1990s, the retirement package was a defined benefit pension. Clear, simple, documented. After 30 years of service, she would receive a guaranteed annual payment, roughly 60% of her final salary, for the rest of her life. The hospital bore the investment risk. The hospital employed actuaries to manage the fund. Margaret's job was to show up, do her work, accumulate years of service, and eventually collect. She was 12 years into her career when the hospital, in language that was reassuring, professional, and thoroughly opaque, transitioned to a defined contribution plan for all new benefit accruals. The pension was frozen. Future contributions would flow into an individual account. The hospital would still contribute. But the management of that money, the investment decisions, the risk of a bad decade in the market, the sequence of returns in the years approaching retirement, all of that moved. It moved from a team of professionals whose entire job was to manage this risk effectively over decades. It moved to Margaret. Margaret, who is an exceptional clinical coordinator, who knows the hospital system inside and out, who is extraordinarily competent at her job, and who had no particular training, expertise, or natural aptitude for managing a complex investment portfolio through multiple market cycles while simultaneously working full-time and raising 2 children. The bridge changed beneath her feet while she was crossing it, and the document explaining what changed was filed somewhere in the benefits archive she has never accessed and would not fully understand if she did. Margaret's situation is not unusual. It is, in fact, the default experience for workers in the private sector across most of the developed world over the past 4 decades. And the retirement crisis that financial commentators keep predicting is not a future event. It is Margaret's generation arriving at retirement and discovering, for the first time, the full weight of what that transition actually cost them. Here is the history, because this story has already played out in slow motion and most people missed it entirely as it was happening. In 1980, approximately 83% of private sector workers who had workplace retirement coverage were enrolled in defined benefit pension plans. Plans where the employer guaranteed a specific monthly payment in retirement based on your years of service and your final salary. The employer funded it. The employer managed it. The employer carried the risk that markets might underperform or that workers might live longer than projected. By 2020, that number had fallen to approximately 13%. That is not a gradual evolution. That is a near total structural replacement of one kind of promise with a categorically different kind of promise. And it happened largely within the working careers of people who are now in their 50s and 60s, people who started work under one system and will retire under another, often without ever having a clear moment where someone sat them down and explained what the change meant for their actual financial security. The shift was not hidden. It was disclosed. Every company that made this transition sent communication to employees. Every transition was documented, filed, compliant with regulation. The paperwork existed. The information was technically available. But there is a significant difference between information being technically available and information being communicated in a way that allows a person to make meaningful decisions in response to it. The language used to describe these transitions was designed by people who understood the implications clearly and who had significant institutional incentive to minimize the perceived magnitude of the change. Words like enhanced flexibility and personal control over your retirement future appeared in materials that were, in effect, announcing the transfer of substantial financial risk from a well-resourced institution to an individual employee who had no particular qualification to absorb it. The bridge was rebuilt. The memo said the new bridge offered improved features. Most people drove across it for a decade before they understood what had actually changed underneath them. Let me tell you about the Ratchet Effect, because this is the mechanism that makes this history specifically dangerous for the people watching this video right now, not just as historical context but as a live, ongoing force in their financial lives. In biology, a ratchet is a device that allows movement in one direction and prevents it in the other. Once it clicks forward, it cannot go back. The movement is permanent. The shift from defined benefit to defined contribution retirement plans has operated like a ratchet in the employment market. Once a company moved away from a defined benefit pension, it did not go back. No company in the modern era has looked at its defined contribution 401k and voluntarily decided to replace it with a guaranteed pension. The direction of travel is one way, and the ratchet clicks forward every time another employer, another sector, another industry makes the transition. Which means the workers currently in defined benefit plans, public sector employees, some unionized workers, certain legacy industries, are operating on a bridge that is still solid steel, but which exists in a context where the manufacturing capacity to build that bridge has largely been dismantled. the expertise, the institutional knowledge, the actuarial infrastructure. It is quietly deteriorating. And the political and economic pressures that drove the private sector transition are now, with varying degrees of subtlety, being applied to the public sector. Here is what that means for you personally. If you are in a defined benefit plan today, the risk is not that your plan disappears tomorrow. The risk is that the plan you are building toward has a future that is less certain than the past of the same plan. Contribution rates change. Benefit formulas get adjusted. Retirement ages shift. Early retirement penalties steepen. The plan exists, but the plan's terms are negotiable in ways that the phrase guaranteed pension does not adequately communicate. And if you are not in a defined benefit plan, if you are in a defined contribution arrangement like the vast majority of private sector workers, then you are already on the other side of the ratchet. The risk has already transferred. The bridge has already been rebuilt. And the question is whether your financial plan accounts for what that actually means in practical terms, or whether it is built on assumptions that belong to the old bridge rather than the new one. Now here is where it gets interesting. And this is the layer of the story that I have seen almost no financial content address honestly. Everyone who discusses the decline of defined benefit pensions frames it as a story about benefits. You used to get this. Now you get that. The framing is almost always about the retirement income, the monthly payment, the guaranteed amount, the security of the promise. But that framing misses the most important element of what actually changed. The most important change was not what you receive. It was who carries the risk of the uncertain future between now and when you receive it. Let me explain what I mean precisely. A defined benefit pension, properly funded, eliminates three specific risks from the individual worker's retirement calculation. It eliminates investment risk, the possibility that markets perform poorly in the decade before you retire, devastating a portfolio right when you need it most. It eliminates longevity risk, the possibility that you live significantly longer than expected and exhaust your savings. And it eliminates sequence of returns risk, the mathematically brutal reality that the order in which returns arrive matters enormously, and a bad sequence early in retirement can permanently damage a portfolio that would have survived the same total returns in a different order. These are not trivial risks. They are not risks that individual investors can eliminate through discipline or intelligence or good decision-making. They are structural features of the investment environment that professional fund managers with decades of experience, billions in assets, and sophisticated hedging tools still struggle to navigate reliably. The transition to defined contribution plans transferred all three of these risks entirely, without negotiation, without compensation for absorbing them, to individual workers who had no particular expertise in managing them. And here is the specific mechanism that makes this transfer so consequential. When you put risk on an institution, a pension fund, an insurance company, a large employer, that institution can pool the risk across thousands or hundreds of thousands of beneficiaries. One person lives to 95. Another dies at 71. The average is manageable. The pool absorbs the variance. No single outcome destroys the system because the system is large enough to contain the range of outcomes within manageable bounds. When you put that risk on an individual, on Margaret, on you, there is no pool. There is only your specific sequence of market returns. Your specific lifespan. Your specific set of circumstances. And if any of those variables diverges significantly from the assumptions in your plan, there is no fund large enough to absorb the variance. There is only your portfolio, and whatever is left of it. That is what the bridge changed. Not the destination. The load-bearing structure. And most people are driving across the new bridge with the weight distribution of the old one, carrying more than the new structure was designed to hold, without knowing that the engineering specification changed. I want to stop for a moment because this is the part of the conversation that I want you to really sit with. The three risks I just described, investment risk, longevity risk, sequence of returns risk, are not abstract. They are not theoretical. They are the specific mechanisms by which retirement plans fail in practice. Not in worst-case catastrophe scenarios. In ordinary, unremarkable real life. Here is what sequence of returns risk looks like in concrete terms. Two people retire on the same day with the same amount of money in their portfolios. They make identical withdrawals every year. They experience the same average annual return over the course of their retirement. One of them runs out of money. The other one doesn't. The only difference between them is the order in which the returns arrived. The person who experienced poor returns in the first 5 years of retirement, drawing down a shrinking portfolio before the recovery, ends up in a fundamentally different position than the person who experienced the same total returns but in a different sequence, with the good years coming first. This is not a hypothetical. This is a documented, well-researched mathematical reality. And it is a risk that the individual investor in a defined contribution plan carries entirely alone. There is no pool. There is no institution absorbing the variance. There is only the sequence your retirement happened to begin in. The defined benefit pension eliminated this risk entirely. Not because pension funds don't experience bad markets. They do. But because the pool is large enough that the sequence experienced by any individual retiree is irrelevant to the fund's overall function. Your retirement year is one of hundreds of thousands. The fund manages toward the average. The individual never faces the sequence. The defined contribution plan puts the individual face-to-face with the sequence. And nobody adequately explained this when they handed over the responsibility. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from, your country, your city. And tell me, did you know before today about sequence of returns risk and how it affects defined contribution plans? I want to know how widely this is actually understood. I read every single comment. Let me run the actual numbers on what this risk transfer costs in real terms. Because the abstract is important but the concrete is what makes it land. Meet two colleagues. I'll call them Richard and Sandra. Both are 55 years old. Both have been with their respective employers for 28 years. Both earn similar incomes throughout their careers, averaging around $85,000 per year. Both have been diligent savers. Richard works for a local government authority that has maintained its defined benefit pension. After 28 years of service, his pension formula entitles him to approximately $44,000 per year starting at age 65. That amount is guaranteed. It is not subject to market conditions. It grows with a modest cost of living adjustment annually. It continues for as long as Richard lives. If he lives to 90, he collects for 25 years. The total payout is enormous. If markets crash the year before he retires, his pension is unchanged. If he happens to retire at the beginning of a poor sequence of market returns, something entirely outside his control, it does not affect his income by a single dollar. Richard does not know about sequence of returns risk in a meaningful way. He has never had to. Sandra works in the private sector. Her employer made the transition away from defined benefit in the mid-1990s, about 10 years into her career. Since then, her retirement savings have been accumulating in an individual account, a defined contribution plan with reasonable employer matching. She has been a disciplined contributor. At 55, her total retirement savings amount to approximately $620,000. She plans to retire at 65, at which point she hopes to draw down approximately $40,000 to $45,000 a year, supplemented by her government benefit. Now here's the thing. Sandra's $620,000 at a 4% withdrawal rate produces approximately $24,800 per year from her portfolio. Her government benefit adds another $18,000 to $22,000. She's in the right range. The plan works on paper. But Sandra's plan has 3 vulnerabilities that Richard's does not. If markets perform poorly in the 3 years before she retires, if her $620,000 becomes $490,000 at the moment she stops contributing and starts withdrawing, the plan changes materially. If she lives to 92, the math gets harder. If her healthcare costs in her late 70s exceed what she planned for, the buffer she assumed is smaller than she modeled. None of these vulnerabilities exist in Richard's situation. Not because Richard made better decisions. Not because Richard saved more or worked harder or planned more cleverly. But because Richard's employer continued to carry the bridge on its books, and Sandra's employer handed it to her. The difference in retirement security between Richard and Sandra is not measured primarily in the dollars either of them saved. It is measured in who bears the risk of the uncertain future. And that difference was handed to Sandra in a memo she probably doesn't remember reading, in language that almost certainly did not communicate this clearly. Here is the layer of this conversation that I find most significant and most underreported. Every discussion about the decline of defined benefit pensions frames it as a story about corporate cost-cutting. Companies wanted to reduce their benefit expenses. The defined contribution plan is cheaper and more predictable. The shift was about the employer's bottom line. That framing is partially true and deeply incomplete. Because here is what it misses. The shift was not just about reducing what employers pay. It was about eliminating from the employer's balance sheet something that accounting standards were increasingly forcing them to disclose: the future liability of their pension obligations. A defined benefit pension is a promise about the future. That promise has a present value. That present value must, under modern accounting standards, be recognized as a liability on the company's books. And pension liabilities are complex, volatile, sensitive to interest rate changes, and difficult to predict with precision. By transitioning to defined contribution plans, employers did not just reduce their benefit costs. They eliminated an entire category of financial uncertainty from their balance sheets. They converted a long-term promise, with all the actuarial complexity and regulatory obligation that comes with it, into a simple, predictable, annually fixed contribution. The contribution is made. The account is funded. The employer's obligation ends. Whatever happens between now and retirement is the employee's problem. This is not a criticism. It is a description of a rational institutional decision that had profound consequences for individuals who were not in a position to evaluate what they were absorbing when the liability transferred. And the reason this framing matters is that it clarifies something important. The shift was not a miscalculation. It was not an error that could be corrected by better policy or better employer intentions. It was the resolution of a fundamental tension between what employers could sustainably promise and what they were increasingly being required to account for transparently. The bridge was rebuilt because the original bridge had structural costs that modern accounting made visible. And once those costs were visible, carrying them became untenable for most institutions. Which means the bridge is not going back. The ratchet has clicked. The question for the individual is not how to restore the old bridge. The question is how to build a structure on your side that is actually calibrated to the load-bearing characteristics of the new one. There is a financial advisor I spoke to a few years ago, someone who has spent 2 decades working specifically with people in their 50s who are discovering, often for the first time, the full implications of the retirement system they are actually in rather than the one they believed they were in. She said something that has stayed with me precisely because of how plainly she said it. She said, "Most of my clients come in thinking they have a retirement plan. What they actually have is a savings account and a hope. The savings account is real. The hope is that the savings account will be enough, that the market will cooperate, that they won't live longer than the money lasts, that nothing unexpected will change the calculation. And the hope is doing a lot of load-bearing work that nobody told them it was doing." She was not being unkind. She was describing what the transfer of risk actually looks like when it arrives at an individual's financial life after 30 years of compounding. The hope is not irrational. It is not wrong to have a defined contribution plan and expect it to fund your retirement. Most of the time, for most people, it does. But there is a specific vulnerability in the architecture of the plan, a set of risks that sit in the hope rather than in the savings account. And those risks are not adequately communicated by the language that was used to announce the transition. The bridge is the bridge. But knowing where the load-bearing structure changed is not the same as knowing the bridge will hold. Now I want to come back to Margaret, because she has been threading through this video, and I said at the beginning that her situation had a specific resolution. And I think what that resolution looks like is more useful than most of what gets said about this topic. Here's where Margaret is today. At 58, with 31 years at the hospital, she has a frozen defined benefit pension that will pay her approximately $28,000 per year starting at 65, the accumulated benefit from the 12 years before the freeze. She has a defined contribution account with approximately $410,000 in it, representing 19 years of contributions and growth since the transition. And she has her government benefit, which she estimates at around $22,000 per year at 67. The plan, on paper, works. $28,000 from the frozen pension. $22,000 from her government benefit. That's $50,000 a year in guaranteed, non-market correlated income. Her defined contribution account needs to supplement that by approximately $25,000 to $30,000 annually to cover her target spending of $75,000 to $80,000 per year. At a 6% to 7% withdrawal rate on $410,000, high, but within a defined contribution framework where she also has significant guaranteed income underpinning it, the plan is viable. But here's what changes when Margaret understands the actual structure she's in. First, her withdrawal rate from the defined contribution account is more aggressive than the standard conservative guidance because her guaranteed income floor is substantial. Understanding this allows her to calibrate her savings target correctly and to stop adding unnecessarily to a pot she doesn't need to be as large as she previously believed. Second, the sequence of returns risk in her plan is concentrated in the defined contribution account. The pension and the government benefit are immune, which means her strategy for managing that account in the decade before retirement, specifically how it's allocated as she approaches the withdrawal phase, needs to be explicitly designed to manage sequence risk rather than just optimize for growth. Third, the biggest variable in her plan is not the size of her defined contribution pot. It is longevity and healthcare costs in the later years. The guaranteed income handles a significant portion of the baseline. The vulnerability sits in a longer than expected life with higher than expected health costs in the final years. Margaret cannot undo what the hospital changed in 2003. The ratchet has clicked. But she can build a financial plan that is actually calibrated to the bridge she is standing on, rather than the bridge that existed when she started her career. And the difference between a plan built around the old architecture and a plan built around the actual architecture she inhabits is not marginal. It is the difference between a plan that is structurally sound and one that is load-bearing on hope. Here is what the exposure looks like when you map it against where different people actually sit right now. If you are under 40 and working in the private sector, there is a strong likelihood that you have never been in a defined benefit plan at any point in your career. The transition happened before your working life began. For you, the defined contribution arrangement is the only system you have ever known. The specific risks we've discussed, investment risk, longevity risk, sequence risk, have been yours since day one, whether you knew it or not. The practical implication is not that your situation is hopeless. It is that your plan needs to be explicitly calibrated to the risks you carry, rather than implicitly assuming those risks are managed by someone else. The old bridge assumption, the one where an institution carries the load-bearing risk, is not available to you. Building a plan that unknowingly relies on it is expensive. If you are between 40 and 55, you may be in the transition generation, people who started working under one system and migrated to another partway through. If your defined benefit accrual was frozen at some point, the frozen portion is a valuable guaranteed income source that needs to be explicitly factored into your withdrawal strategy. Many people in this position undervalue the frozen benefit because it's relatively small in isolation. In context, as a guaranteed, non-market correlated income floor, it is worth significantly more than its headline annual figure implies. If you are over 55 and still in a defined benefit plan, your specific risk is not the disappearance of your plan. It is the plan's evolution between now and when you claim. Contribution rates, benefit formulas, retirement ages, early exit penalties, these are all terms that have been revised in similar plans elsewhere and can be revised in yours. The plan is not the same plan it was when you joined. And assuming it will be the same plan at the point of claim as it is today is a planning assumption worth examining. 3 things that change the calculus for anyone currently building a retirement plan, not generic advice, specific to the actual structural reality of the system as it exists today. First, map your guaranteed income floor explicitly. List every source of income in your retirement that arrives regardless of market conditions. your defined benefit pension if you have one, the frozen portion if applicable, your government benefit, any annuity, any rental income from property. Total that figure. That floor is not just income, it is the risk-free foundation beneath your entire plan. Every dollar of guaranteed income reduces the load your defined contribution savings need to carry. Most people underestimate the floor because they're focused on the portfolio. Know your floor precisely. Second, understand where your sequence of returns risk is concentrated and manage around it explicitly. If you have a significant defined contribution account and you are within 10 years of retirement, the allocation of that account needs to account for sequence risk, not just optimize for expected long-term return. The standard growth-oriented allocation that made sense during the accumulation phase becomes a structural vulnerability as you approach withdrawal. This is not an argument for moving entirely to conservative investments. It is an argument for understanding that the transition from accumulation to withdrawal is a specific risk inflection point that requires an explicit strategy, not a gradual drift. Third, the one that nobody wants to hear. If your retirement plan requires your defined contribution account to carry more load than is realistic given the risks you are exposed to, the answer is not to simply save more and hope the math works. The answer is to understand which elements of your plan are genuinely risk-free, which elements are carrying hope instead of structure, and where the gap lies, so that you can make deliberate decisions about how to address it. Sometimes the answer is to work a few years longer. Sometimes it is to reduce the target retirement spending. Sometimes it is to optimize the guaranteed income floor rather than the portfolio. The plan that accounts for the actual architecture of the bridge you're on is more useful than the plan that is built around the bridge that used to exist. The bridge is the whole story. The ground on your side, the ground on the other side, and what is actually holding you up in between. Most people know the destination. Most people do not know what changed in the load-bearing structure somewhere in the middle of their crossing. Now you know. The bridge changed. The ratchet has clicked. The question is whether your plan is calibrated to the bridge that exists or the bridge that is gone. Most people will watch this, absorb it, and return to the plan they had. The brain protects its own assumptions. That's fine. But now you know what the load-bearing structure looks like on the bridge you are actually crossing. If any part of this landed differently than what you normally encounter in financial content, if it named something you felt but never had the framework for, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me whether you're in a defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan, or somewhere in the transition between the two. I read every single comment and the answers genuinely shape what I cover next. Share this with someone in your life who is building a retirement plan without the full picture of what changed in the structure underneath it. Not as an alarm. As a map. Like this video if it gave you something real. Subscribe. We have this kind of conversation every week. No products to sell, no agenda beyond the honest picture. And if you want to go deeper on the specific mechanics of managing sequence of returns risk in the decade before retirement, how to structure a defined contribution account as you approach the withdrawal phase, that video is on this channel. Go watch it next. See you in the comments.